Everyone in the high-stakes corridors of Manhattan knew the name Yu Sung-kwon. He was a man who didn't just move money. He moved the tectonic plates of the underworld. But the night he sat in the velvet shadows of the Gwangyang Lounge and dismissed a woman as a mere invisible servant, he made the first fatal miscalculation of his life. He thought he was looking at a girl who lived for tips and small talk. He didn't see the hypervigilance in her stillness or the way her ears filtered the room's frequencies with the precision of a field agent. He didn't know that the woman adjusting his drink wasn't intimidated by his gold chains or his volatile temper. She wasn't afraid of the king of New York. She was afraid of the ghost she had spent 3 years trying to bury, a ghost that was now clawing its way back to the surface. The air inside the lounge was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood, heavy cologne, and the metallic tang of suppressed violence. It was a space governed by the Yu Gwangyang Circle, where the clinking of crystal glasses punctuated conversations about million-dollar betrayals. Marisah Cole adjusted her sleek, tight bun, keeping her eyes fixed on the tray of high-end scotch. She had been a ghost at the Gwangyang for 6 months, perfecting the art of being part of the furniture. Her crisp white uniform and neatly tied apron masked the athletic, controlled build of a woman who had spent years in the deep cover shadows of Seoul. Here, she wasn't the operative who had dismantled entire cells in the dark. Here, she was just the waitress who stayed in the blue-toned shadows while the red-lit aggression of the Mafia burned at the center table. Everyone in the high-stakes corridors of Manhattan knew the name Yu Sung-kwon. He was a man who didn't just move money. He moved the tectonic plates of the underworld. But the night he sat in the velvet shadows of the Gwangyang Lounge and dismissed a woman as a mere invisible servant, he made the first fatal miscalculation of his life. He thought he was looking at a girl who lived for tips and small talk. He didn't see the hypervigilance in her stillness or the way her ears filtered the room's frequencies with the precision of a field agent. He didn't know that the woman adjusting his drink wasn't intimidated by his gold chains or his volatile temper. She wasn't afraid of the king of New York. She was afraid of the ghost she had spent 3 years trying to bury, a ghost that was now clawing its way back to the surface. The air inside the lounge was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood, heavy cologne, and the metallic tang of suppressed violence. It was a space governed by the Yu Gwangyang Circle, with a clinking of crystal glasses punctuated conversations about million-dollar betrayals. Marisah Cole adjusted her sleek, tight bun, keeping her eyes fixed on the tray of high-end scotch. She had been a ghost at the Gwangyang for 6 months, perfecting the art of being part of the furniture. Her crisp white uniform and neatly tied apron masked the athletic, controlled build of a woman who had spent years in the deep cover shadows of Seoul. Here, she wasn't the operative who had dismantled entire cells in the dark. Here, she was just the waitress who stayed in the blue-toned shadows while the red-lit aggression of the Mafia burned at the center table. Sung-kwon leaned back, his tailored black suit straining against his broad shoulders as he gestured dismissively toward a folder of acquisition papers. His voice was a low, melodic rasp, speaking in a dialect of Korean so thick and archaic it was designed to be a wall against the uninitiated. "The Americans are children playing with matches," he scoffed to his lieutenants, unaware of the woman standing inches away. "They think they can buy our history with their paper currency. This deal is a dog's carcass, rotten at the bone and not worth the effort of burying." The table erupted in sycophantic laughter, the sound of men who knew better than to correct a lion. Marisah felt the familiar itch at the base of her skull, the one that used a trigger during long-term surveillance when a target's arrogance finally eclipsed their intelligence. She set the glass of 30-year-old Yamazaki down with a soft, steady click. The red light of the chandelier overhead caught the gold of Sung-kwon's heavy bracelet, but the cool blue light of the hallway silhouetted her composed, unmoving frame. She didn't lower her head. She didn't shuffle away. Instead, she let her gaze drift upward, locking eyes with the man who considered himself untouchable. "Your business logic is as stagnant as the Han River in winter, Sung-kwon SSI," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a ceramic blade. The room went unnervingly silent. The Korean she spoke wasn't the broken phrases of a tourist. It was the sharp, biting high dialect used by the old families of the Gwangyang district, the language of his own blood. And as for your lineage, even a stray dog knows not to piss on the hand that offers it a seat at the table. You are so blinded by your own reflection that you miss the poison in the contract's fine print. The silence that followed Marisah's words was not merely quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the VIP lounge until the air felt thin and brittle. Yu Sung-kwan did not move. His mouth remained slightly open, his brows furrowed in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. Beside him, his lieutenants froze like statues in a garden of red velvet, their hands hovering near their jackets, but their minds unable to process the linguistic hand grenade that had just detonated in their midst. Sung-kwan slowly straightened his spine, his tailored black suit shifting with a soft, expensive rustle. He loomed over the table, his intense eyes narrowing as they searched Marisah's face for a trace of the trembling mouse he had assumed she was. He found nothing. She stood grounded, her chin slightly raised, her expression carrying the quiet, irreversible authority of a woman who had just burned a bridge and was now watching the flames with a sense of relief. "What did you just say?" he whispered, the Korean word for what's sliding out like a low, dangerous snarl. Marisah didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, invading the personal space he usually guarded with the threat of death. "I said," she began, her tone dropping into a lethal, rasping whisper that vibrated beneath the low hum of the club's bass, "that your ancestors would weep to see their name carried by a man who cannot read the greed in his own partner's eyes." She then pivoted to a curse, an old, jagged Gwangyang insult that questioned the very foundation of his honor, a phrase so sharp it was considered a physical blow in the pits of Seoul. The shock on Sung-kwan's face fractured into a raw, jagged rage. He lunged forward, his heavy gold bracelet clattering against the mahogany table as he grabbed her wrist with a grip meant to crush. "Who are you?" he roared, his voice echoing off the polycarbonate windows. "No American waitress knows that dialect. No, nobody speaks to me of my lineage." Marisah felt her pulse hammer against his thumb, but her breathing remained rhythmic, in through the nose, out through the mouth, just as she had been trained in the shadows of the company. She didn't struggle. She didn't beg for mercy. Instead, she let a cold, predatory smile touch her lips, a smile that belonged to the operative she had tried to bury. "I'm the person who just saved you $15 million, Sung-kwan SSI, she replied, her voice flat and composed. "And I'm the only person in this room who knows that the Black Ops team currently entering your service elevator isn't here to provide security." The grip on her wrist faltered. For a fleeting second, the arrogance in Sung-kwan's eyes was replaced by a flickering, dawning realization. He looked at the clumsy girl in the crisp white shirt and saw, for the first time, the steel calluses of a killer hidden beneath the skin. The dialect of disrespect had been a warning. The first shot fired in a war that was already at his doorstep. The silence that followed the shatter of the Gwangyang's rigid hierarchy was heavy, vibrating with the collective intake of breath from every man in the room. It was a silence that carried a specific kind of gravity, the kind that exists just before a mountain collapses. Sung-kwan stood paralyzed, his fingers still locked around Marisah's wrist, but the pressure had changed from a crushing grip to a desperate tether. He was no longer the king of New York staring down a servant. He was a man staring at a mirror that had just told him he was blind. His lieutenants, men who had spent decades learning to read the subtle shifts in their boss's mood, remained frozen in the red-washed light of the lounge. They looked from Marisah's cool, composed features to Sung-kwan's shocked face, waiting for the order to erase her from existence. But the order didn't come. Sung-kwan's brows were furrowed, his eyes searching hers not for an apology, but for the source of the authority she had just wielded like a weapon. "You hear it, don't you?" Marisah whispered, her voice a low, steady frequency that cut through the silence. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she stood grounded, her posture a stark contrast to the instability radiating from the table. "The silence in the service elevator? That's not a malfunction. It's the sound of the air being cleared for a vacuum. Sung Kwan's gaze flicked toward the heavy iron doors at the edge of the VIP room, his jaw tightening. The arrogance that usually defined him was being rapidly stripped away, replaced by the sharp, predatory curiosity of a survivor. He looked back at Marisah, noticing for the first time that her hands weren't trembling. There was no apology in her eyes, only a clinical readiness that made the fine hair on his neck stand up. "You corrected me," he murmured, his voice barely a rasp. "You stood in front of the circle and spat on my name in a tongue you have no right to know." "I have every right," she countered, her green eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to burn through the blue-toned shadows around her. "I've spent half my life cleaning up the messes made by men who think their gold chains make them immortal. If you want to live long enough to punish me for my insolence, you'll drop the ego and start listening to the footsteps in the hall." One of the lieutenants finally broke, his hand reaching for the holster beneath his tailored jacket. "Boss, let me handle this." "Stay back," Sung Kwan roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with a force that made the glasses on the table chatter. He didn't look away from Marisah. He released her wrists slowly, his thumb tracing the faint marks his grip had left on her skin. He saw the athletic, controlled build beneath her uniform, the way her weight shifted to her heels in anticipation of a strike. The predator was beginning to recognize a peer. The silence in the circle had transitioned from shock to a grim, tactical realization. The invisible waitress was gone, replaced by the blue shadow, and as the first muffled thud of a breaching charge vibrated through the floorboards, the King of New York realized he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room. The chaos of the initial breach had left the lounge a graveyard of shattered crystal and cooling brass, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. Tucked behind the reinforced mahogany bar, Sung Kwan watched Marisah through the haze of plaster dust. She was currently stripping a sidearm from a fallen mercenary with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. Her movements weren't those of a frightened woman, but of a professional clearing a workspace. "You said you were a waitress," Sung Kwan rasped, his eyes tracking the way she checked the magazine of the captured pistol before engaging the safety. His voice, usually a tool of absolute command, carried a rare tremor of dawning realization. Marisah didn't look up. "And you said this lounge was a fortress?" "We were both lying," she replied, her voice as flat and cold as the concrete floor. Sung Kwan reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a slim, encrypted tablet, a device linked to the Guangxiong's private intelligence network. He didn't just want her name, he wanted to understand the anomaly standing before him. As he initiated a deep-layer search, the device's red light reflected in his pupils, a digital retinal scan searching for a face that shouldn't exist in the public record. 3 years in New York. No prior tax records. No digital footprint before 2023. Sung Kwan murmured, scrolling through the void where her history should have been. He watched her profile, the sharp jawline, the steady, rhythmic breathing that controlled her heart rate, even after a firefight. "You speak the Guangxiong dialect like you were born in the shadow of the Blue House, yet you possess the tactical pacing of a NATO asset." Marisah finally turned, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the tablet's data feel irrelevant. "Stop looking for a ghost, Sung Kwan. The people who erased me spent millions to make sure that tablet returns nothing but static." "The company?" he asked, using the shorthand for intelligence agencies he had only encountered in high-level whispers. "Is that why you're hiding in a uniform 2 sizes too big? Because half of Seoul wants to collect the bounty on the woman who knew too much?" Marisah stepped closer, the cool blue light of the emergency lanterns highlighting the sleek, tight bun that served as her final mask. She placed a hand on the tablet, forcing it down. "They don't want to collect a bounty. They want to ensure I never speak that dialect again. If you keep digging, you're not just uncovering my past. You're inviting the people who built me to finish the job they started in the iron pit." Sung Kwan looked at her scarred, steady hands and then back at the blank screen. The King of New York realized that the waitress wasn't his servant, and she wasn't just his protector. She was a living weapon that had been discarded, and by pulling her into his orbit, he had just painted a target on his own chest that no amount of gold could hide. The scent of expensive tobacco had been replaced by the acrid sting of ozone and bleach as Marisah led Sungkwon through the labyrinthine service corridors toward the back of the house. The kitchen of the Gwangseong was a cavernous expanse of stainless steel and shadow, usually a frantic hive of industry, but now eerily still. Marisah moved with a natural predatory grace. Her weight shifted perfectly to her heels, her eyes scanning the high-gloss surfaces for reflections that shouldn't be there. "Stay behind the prep island," Marisah commanded, her voice dropping to a flat, cold rasp. Sungkwon, a man used to commanding rooms without resistance, found himself obeying the waitress without question, his pride subsumed by the chilling efficiency of her movements. He watched her from the shadows of a walk-in freezer, noticing how she didn't just walk. She cleared the room in sections, her gaze a clinical tool of geometry. The attack didn't come with a roar, but with a microscopic click of metal on metal. A shadow detached itself from the walk-in pantry. A man dressed in the nondescript gray of the maintenance crew, his movement too fast, too precise for a janitor. He didn't go for a gun. He lunged with a ceramic blade designed to pass through metal detectors and skin with equal ease. Marisah didn't flinch. Her body took over with a burst of speed that defied physics, a ghost waking up from a 3-year slumber. She dropped her level, slipping the initial thrust with a boxer's precision before her left hand shot up to check the assassin's forearm. The sound of the collision was sickeningly wet, the absolute efficiency of bone meeting cartilage. "You're sloppy," Marisah hissed in that biting, high-dialect Korean, her green eyes sharp as cut glass. She pivoted on her right foot, driving her elbow upward into the attacker's solar plexus with perfect hip rotation. The air left the man's lungs in a violent whoosh, his diaphragm paralyzed by the liver shot she had once used to drop a Mafia kingpin to his knees. Before the assassin could recover, Marisah had him pinned against a stainless steel counter, the ceramic blade now pressed against his own throat. She didn't look like a waitress in a crisp white shirt. She looked like a killer who had found her way home. "Who sent the cleanup crew?" she demanded, her voice a dangerous purr. The man sputtered, blood trickling from his split lip, but before he could speak, a second red dot appeared on the stainless steel beside Marisah's head. "Down!" she screamed, hauling Sungkwon toward the industrial dishwashers as a suppressed round shattered a stack of porcelain plates. The shadow in the kitchen wasn't alone. The hunt wasn't just on. It had moved into the dead zone, and the woman who had spent years trying to be a nobody was now the only thing standing between the king of New York and an unmarked grave. The smell of gunpowder and ozone tore through the remaining haze of expensive sandalwood, turning the once glamorous Gwangseong lounge into a kill zone. Marisah moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a woman who had spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment of chaos. She didn't spray bullets. She moved with a burst of speed that defied physics, navigating the red-lit wreckage of the VIP booth with the absolute efficiency of movement she had honed in the brutal fighting pits of the past. Sungkwon crouched behind an overturned mahogany table, his tailored black luxury suit now covered in the chalky white dust of shredded drywall. For a man who had commanded rooms with a mere look, the sensation of being pinned down was a violent shock to his ego. He watched Marisah through the smoke. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like a whirlwind of steel and intelligence, her green eyes sharp as cut glass as she tracked the muzzle flashes of the breaching team. 2 shooters at the service entrance, one in the rafters. Marisah's voice cut through the popping of semi-automatic pistols like a ceramic blade. She reached into a hidden compartment of her tactical bag and pulled out a flashbang, a relic of a life she had tried to bury beneath a crisp white uniform. With a practice flick, she tossed the device. The concussive blast shook the building, and in the blinding white light, the power dynamic in the room shifted irreversibly. Marisah didn't wait for the spots to clear from her vision. She vaulted over the table, a move requiring immense core strength, and used the momentum to drive a high heel into the lead gunman's temple. The sound was sickeningly wet, the absolute efficiency of a professional who knew exactly where the vital organs were hidden. She caught a falling submachine gun by the strap, spun around, and used the slumping body of the mercenary as a human shield. Her fingers, cool and firm even as the world burned around her, adjusted the magazine with a mechanical precision that made Sung Kwan's heart hammer against his ribs. "Drink," she commanded, kicking a half-shattered bottle of premium soju toward him as she provided suppressing fire. "Now isn't the time for a toast, Marisah," Sung Kwan rasped, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance as he ducked beneath a spray of bullets. "It's not for drinking. It's for the adrenaline," she countered, her gaze locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. "Because in 30 seconds, we're going to run, and I need you to move like a hunter, not a king." The King of New York looked at his scarred, calloused hand, and then at the woman who had just cleared a room of Spec Ops mercenaries in 14 seconds. The smoke, the gunpowder, and the sharp sting of the soju created a cocktail of survival that finally broke his pride. He took her hand, a scarred, steady lifeline, and for the first time in 10 years, Yu Sung Kwan prepared to fight for a throne he no longer owned alone. The neighborhood of Astoria was quiet, the air smelling of exhaust fumes and damp pavement as the stolen sedan glided into the shadows of a crumbling brick tenement. Sung Kwan looked at his $3,000 shoes, then at the graffiti-sprayed front door, his expression a mixture of insult and disbelief. He was the king of New York, yet he was being led into a queen's tenement by a woman who had just dismantled his world. The apartment on the 4th floor was a walk-up, a studio barely larger than a prison cell. It was a space designed for a ghost, devoid of pictures, decorations, or any trace of a human heart. A single mattress lay on the floor with military precision, and a small table held a stack of burner phones and a laptop. This wasn't a home. It was a fatal funnel, a fortress of necessity where someone could leave in 5 minutes and leave no trace behind. "Take off your shirt," Marisah ordered, her voice clinical as she pried open a loose floorboard to retrieve a trauma bag. Sung Kwan raised a dark, meticulously styled eyebrow, the old arrogance flickering for a brief second. "At least buy me dinner first," he rasped, though the wit was thin. He unbuttoned his stained luxury suit, revealing a torso that was a map of violent scars, bullets, knives, and wire, reminders of the price he had paid for his untouchable status. Currently, a massive, darkening bruise bloomed across his ribs where the impact of the lounge fight had left its mark. Marisah snapped on latex gloves, her fingers cool and firm as she began to palpate the injury. When she pressed against his lower ribs, Sung Kwan hissed in pain, his eyes locking onto hers in the blue-toned shadows. Without the oversized uniform, without the act of the clumsy waitress, she was captivating, her movements economical, intelligent, and lethal. "Why didn't you let them finish it?" Sung Kwan asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "I treated you like garbage. I am everything a woman like you should hate." Marisah paused, her green eyes reflecting a terrifying intensity. "You did," she agreed flatly. "But when the shooting started, you didn't use me as a shield. You told me to get down. You tried to be the shield for me." She pulled her hand away, taping a bandage over a graze on his shoulder. "I'm used to being a weapon, Sung Kwan. You're the first one in a long time who looked at me and saw a person worth protecting." The air in the tiny room felt heavy, charged with the static of two predators finally recognizing one another. As dawn broke over Queens, casting a sickly gray light into the studio, Sung Kwan watched her move to the window to check the locks. He realized he was seeing the real woman beneath the layers of trauma, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel the need to sleep with one eye open. He had the Empress of Astoria guarding his 6. The darkness of the Queen's tenement was a leveling force, stripping away the gold and the glamour until only the raw architecture of survival remained. Without his armored SUVs, his wall of silent bodyguards, or the retinal scans of the Steinway fortress, Sung Kwan was merely a man in a ruined suit, leaning against a damp wall. Beside him, Marisah sat on the edge of the narrow mattress, the stolen pistol resting in her lap as she cleaned the slide with a piece of her discarded apron. "We have no safe houses left," Sung Kwan admitted, his voice a hollow rasp that lacked its usual kingly resonance. My accounts are frozen, and the Guangxiang Council has likely put a price on my head that makes the Berlin bounty look like pocket change. Marisah didn't look up from her work, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a woman who had learned to find her way in the dark long ago. Titles don't stop bullets, Sungkwon, and money only buys you a more expensive grave. She set the gun down and looked at him, her green eyes reflecting the sickly gray light filtering through the blinds. Out there, you're a person of interest. In here, you're just a student who needs to learn how to move without making a sound. The dynamic shifted completely in the cramped studio. The hierarchy of the obsidian was gone. Here, Marisah was the master, and the Mafia Don was the stray she had brought home. She moved toward him, her footsteps silent on the warped floorboards, and placed a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort, but to correct his posture. "You fight with ego," she murmured, her face inches from his. "You're used to the world bending because of who your father was. But the gallows don't care about your lineage." She moved behind him, her cool fingers tracing the line of his spine, forcing him to settle his weight. "If you want to take your city back, you have to stop being the wave that breaks against the rocks. You have to be the water that flows through the cracks." Sungkwon felt the heat of her proximity, a kinetic energy that felt more dangerous than the mercenaries hunting them. He was a tiger in a cardboard box, stripped of his crown, but as he looked at Marisah, the waitress who cleared rooms in 14 seconds, he found a steely respect replacing his frustration. "Help me," he whispered into the darkness, the admission hanging heavy between them. "Teach me to be the ghost." Marisah leaned into his touch for a fleeting second, a rare fracture in her professional mask, before she pulled back into the shadows. "I'll take the floor tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You're injured. Take the mattress. We share back-to-back." In the absolute silence of the Astoria night, the King of New York and the Phantom of Seoul lay in wait. They had no resources, no army, and no names. Only the shared rhythm of their breathing and the cold steel of the guns under their pillows. For the first time in 10 years, they weren't looking over their shoulders. They were guarding each other's six. The blue-gray dawn of Queens bled through the blinds, casting a cage of light across the studio floor. Sungkwon sat with his back against the wall, watching Marisah strip and reassemble the stolen pistol with the rhythmic, haunting focus of a monk. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was pressurized by the secrets they had carried into the dark. "You spoke that dialect like it was your first language," Sungkwon said, his voice a low rasp that broke the stillness. "And you fight like a woman who was raised in a cage. Berlin wasn't your beginning, Marisah. Where did you truly learn to slip a jab like that?" Marisah didn't stop her hands. The click of the slide was the only sound in the room. "My father was a man who wanted a son, but got a daughter," she said, her voice flat and clinical. "So, he decided to build the weapon he wanted out of the child he had." She looked up, her green eyes reflecting a cold, distant fire. "He was a high-ranking asset in Seoul. He didn't send me to school. He sent me to the pits." She set the gun down and pulled the collar of her shirt aside, revealing a small, jagged scar at the base of her neck. "By 22, I was deep cover. I was the ghost in the machine for the intelligence cells, moving through the underworld like air. But I saw the ledgers, Sungkwon. I saw that the men I worked for were the same ones selling children to the syndicates." "Is that why you fled?" Sungkwon asked, his intensity shifting from curiosity to a grim, shared recognition. "I refused to throw a fight that would have solidified a monster's power," she whispered, the memory hitting her like a freight train. "The syndicate put a $5 million bounty on my head before I even cleared the harbor. My father was the one who signed the warrant." She looked at her calloused knuckles, the thick yellow skin a testament to a decade of violence. "I killed him to get out of that city. I'm not a waitress, and I'm not a hero. I am a monster that escaped its master." The admission hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. Sungkwon didn't flinch. In his world, survival was the only morality that mattered. He reached out, his hand steady as he cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You're not a monster, Marisah," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "You're a queen in exile, and your father was just the first fool who underestimated what he had created. For a fleeting second, the phantom vanished, and the woman beneath leaned into his touch, allowing herself the luxury of human contact she had denied herself for years. They were two predators who had finally found the only other creature on Earth who understood the weight of the mask. The studio apartment in Astoria had been transformed from a hiding spot into a grueling laboratory of violence. For 2 weeks, the space beneath the rattling elevated train tracks became their entire universe, a place where the King of New York was stripped of his suits and his wealth to be rebuilt from zero. The dynamic had shifted completely. Inside these four walls, Marisah was the master, and Seungkwan was the student. Seungkwan stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving, his bare shoulders slick with sweat and marked by the fading maps of his past. He lunged with a straight right, a punch meant to end things instantly through sheer force. Marisah didn't move her feet. She simply slipped the jab with a microscopic movement to the left, letting his momentum carry him into empty air. "You fight with ego," Marisah told him, her voice a low, clinical rasp as she circled him. "Anger makes you predictable. Predictable makes you dead." Seungkwan growled, turning to throw a heavy hook, but Marisah caught his forearm, redirecting the energy of his blow harmlessly into the space beside her. She moved with an economy of force that was hypnotic, calculating every angle before he even committed his weight. To an untrained eye, her stance looked amateurish, but Seungkwan was beginning to see the lethal intelligence behind her open palms. "Don't try to break the wave, Seungkwan," she murmured, stepping into his personal space until he could smell the faint scent of vanilla beneath the gunpowder and sweat. "Be the water." Frustration boiled in his gut, but was being slowly burned away by exhaustion and a growing, steely respect. He realized he was seeing the real woman beneath the layers of survival instinct. She wasn't just teaching him how to punch, she was teaching him how to see. After a grueling session, they lay panting on the narrow mattress, staring at the peeling ceiling. "Why did you leave the life?" Seungkwan asked, his voice a quiet rasp in the darkness. "You're a tiger, Marisah. You can't pretend to be a house cat." He reached out his hand, trembling slightly from the exertion, and cupped her face. There was no cruelty in his eyes now, only reverence for the predator who had finally found the only other creature on Earth who understood her. Marisah looked at him, searching for the lie, but found only the resolve of the man who was finally learning to lead without a crown. "If we take the city back," he whispered, his thumb tracing her jawline, "you won't have to hide anymore. We build a kingdom where the tiger walks free." Marisah leaned into his touch for a heartbeat, allowing herself the luxury of a human connection she had denied herself for years. "Okay," she whispered. The training was over. The hunt was about to begin. The blue-toned shadows of the Astoria studio were illuminated only by the cold glow of Marisah's laptop as she pulled up the logs from the burner phones. Outside, the rattle of the elevated train acted as a rhythmic shroud for their conversation. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and impending betrayal. Seungkwan sat beside her, his broad shoulders tensed as he watched the digital trail Marisah had meticulously reconstructed from the cloned SIM cards. A traitor doesn't just leave. They leave a breadcrumb trail for the people they think are more powerful, Marisah murmured, her fingers flying across the keys with the clinical precision of a ghost. She pointed to 3 outgoing messages sent at 2 a.m. to a destination unknown number. "We are in Astoria. 4th floor brick building. Waitress is the shooter." Seungkwan's face went stone cold, the red light of the laptop reflecting in his eyes like a warning sign. "Victor," he hissed, his voice a dangerous purr. He looked at the man slumped in the corner's only chair, an associate from the Chicago outfit who had been rescued during the initial breach at the Obsidian. Victor was snoring, oblivious to the fact that he was breathing on borrowed time. Marisah didn't yell. The cold calm of the phantom descended over her. She walked over to the chair, grabbed a handful of Victor's greasy hair, and slammed his face into the wooden armrest. Victor woke with a shriek of terror as Seungkwan stood instantly, his stolen pistol drawn and aimed at the man's chest. "You sold us to the gallows after I saved your miserable life," Sungkwon roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with the authority of a king reclaiming his throne. "They threatened my mother," Victor blubbered, spitting blood onto his shirt. "I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Sungkwon replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't kill him," Marisah commanded, her voice flat and composed as she checked the magazine of her own weapon. "He's a liability dead, but an asset alive. If he's texting them, they're listening." She shoved the burner phone back into Victor's trembling hands, her green eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. "Text them back. Tell them the bodyguard is dead and the door is unlocked." Sungkwon looked at her, the frustration of his wounded ego being replaced by a steely respect for her tactical awareness. "Why?" he asked. "Because I want them to come through that door thinking they've already won," Marisah said, her smile a terrifying expression that promised nothing but violence. She kicked the mattress onto its side, creating a makeshift barricade, and gestured for Sungkwon to take cover. The trader's banquet was set, and the main course was about to be served in gunpowder and lead. The fog rolling off the East River was thick and tasted of salt and industrial rot, clinging to the rusted girders of the Pulaski Bridge like a burial shroud. Sungkwon stood at the center of the span, the wind whipping his open collar against his neck, his silhouette sharpened by the flickering orange glow of a nearby street lamp. Beside him, Victor trembled, his hands zip-tied and his face a map of bruises, the bait for a trap that had been set in the shadows of an Astoria tenement. Across the asphalt, 3 black SUVs sat idling, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of deep-sea predators. A man stepped out from the lead vehicle, his silhouette heavy and aggressive. Between 2 guards, a younger man with Sungkwon's sharp jawline struggled against his restraints. Sungkwon's brother, the final leverage the gallows held over the Gwanxiang throne. "You look small without your kingdom, Sungkwon," the lead gunman shouted, his voice echoing off the iron bridge. "No suits, no soldiers, just you and a traitor." Sungkwon didn't flinch. He'd spent the last 2 weeks learning to be the water, and right now, he was a calm before the storm. "The kingdom is built on blood, not fabric," he replied, his voice a dangerous, steady rasp. "Exchange the boy, and you might live long enough to see me burn it down." The exchange began with a rhythmic, agonizing slowness. Victor was shoved forward, stumbling toward the SUV, while Sungkwon's brother was pushed toward the center of the bridge. The tension was a physical weight, vibrating silently beneath the hum of the idling engines. "Wait," the lead gunman barked, his hand hovering over a suppressed pistol as he peered into the darkness behind Sungkwon. "Where's the girl? The shooter?" "She's exactly where she needs to be," Sungkwon murmured. In that moment, a red laser appeared on the lead gunman's forehead, a microscopic bloom of light from the bridge's upper girders. Marisah was a blue-toned shadow high above, her breathing rhythmic, her finger tightening on the trigger with the absolute efficiency of the Phantom. "Down!" Sungkwon roared as the bridge erupted into chaos. The first shot took the lead gunman in the throat before he could draw his weapon. Marisah didn't spray and pray. She fired single, precise shots that turned the bridge into a dead zone for the gallows. She dropped from the girders like a wraith, landing in a roll and using the momentum to sweep the legs of a guard who had leveled a weapon at Sungkwon's brother. Sungkwon moved with a speed he had never possessed before, slipping a jab from a closing mercenary and driving a shovel hook into the man's solar plexus with perfect hip rotation. The liver shot Marisah had taught him the dark. The silence returned to the bridge, heavier than before, broken only by the lapping of the river below. Sungkwon pulled his brother to his feet, but his eyes were locked on Marisah as she emerged from the mist, the cool blue light highlighting her composed, unmoving frame. "The exchange is over," she said, her voice a flat, cold rasp. "Now we take the head off the snake." The basement of Iron Eddies smelled of stale sweat, cold iron, and the heavy, chemical scent of gun oil. It was a ghost of a building where the map ended, the perfect sanctuary for a phantom preparing to reclaim her throne. Sungkwan stood by the heavy steel door, watching as Marisah reached into a reinforced storage crate hidden beneath the floorboards. She pulled out a bundle of matte black Kevlar and high-density polymer, gear that had been clean and dormant for 3 years. This wasn't the crisp, white uniform of a waitress or the oversized apron she had used as a shield. This was the armor of the underdog. As she began to strap the plates over her slender but dense muscle, the transformation was chilling. The clumsy girl was gone, replaced by a woman who moved with an economy of force that made Sungkwan's chest tighten with a mixture of awe and reverence. Marisah adjusted the tactical harness, checking the seals on the specialized ceramic blades and the magazines for her suppressed pistols. She didn't look at the gear as tools. She handled them with the phantom-like familiarity of a predator returning to its natural state. When she finally pulled the dark combat boots tight and stood upright, her posture was grounded, her chin slightly raised in the cool blue light of the gym. "You look like you're going to war," Sungkwan murmured, his voice a low rasp that carried no trace of his former arrogance. He was dressed in a simple, dark tuxedo Eddie had provided, but beside Marisah, he felt like a student standing next to a master of the craft. "I'm going to finish a conversation I started in Seoul," Marisah replied, her green eyes sharp and cold as cut glass. She handed him a spare tactical earpiece and a compact sidearm. Her movements were clinical, her breathing rhythmic as she controlled the rush of adrenaline flooding her system. She turned to face him, her hands steady as she checked the fit of his jacket, ensuring his weapon wouldn't snag. For a fleeting second, her gaze softened, the phantom, mask cracking just enough to show the woman who had shared a mattress back-to-back with him in the dark. "This armor doesn't make us invincible," she whispered, her face inches from his. "It just gives us 14 seconds to take the head off the snake before the rest of the world catches up." Sungkwan reached out, his hand cupping the side of her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw where the blue light caught the intensity of her resolve. He wasn't looking at a waitress, and he wasn't looking at a weapon. He was looking at his equal. "Then let's go," he said, taking her hand. "Let's show them what happens when the tiger finally walks free." The Obsidian was no longer a club. It was a display of vulgar excess and a fortress of the damned. Inside the Guangxiong penthouse, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cognac and the sickening static of stolen power. Don Carlo Gallo sat in the seat that had once belonged to the Red King, surrounded by sycophants who toasted to a dead man. But as the main breaker tripped and the room plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness, the laughter died instantly. 10 seconds later, the emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the velvet and gold in an eerie, prophetic red glow. Standing in the center of the room was Yu Sungkwan. He was clean-shaven, wearing a vintage tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, looking untouched and immortal. Beside him stood Marisah, her sleek backless dress concealing the matte black Kevlar plates and the suppressed pistol she held with a terrifying, rhythmic stillness. "Carlo," Sungkwan's voice boomed over the stunned silence, vibrating with the authority of a man who had been reborn in the pits of Astoria. "You're sitting in my chair." Carlo scrambled up, his face pale as a sheet of bone. You're dead." "I was," Sungkwan replied, stepping forward as the crowd parted like the Red Sea. "But I didn't like the accommodations in hell." The order to kill them both shattered the tension, and the penthouse erupted into a whirlwind of cinematic violence. For guards drew their weapons, but Marisah didn't hesitate. She kicked a heavy mahogany table onto its side, creating instant cover and signaling for the king to move. Sungkwan didn't cower. He vaulted the table with a speed he had never possessed before, his movements now stripped of ego and replaced by the absolute efficiency Marisah had burned into his muscle memory. A giant bodyguard swung a massive haymaker, but the new Sungkwan didn't block it. He slipped the punch with a microscopic movement to the left. As the man's momentum carried him forward, Sungkwan drove his fist into the man's liver, a shovel hook delivered with perfect hip rotation. The sound was sickeningly wet as the guard collapsed, gasping for air that would not come. Beside him, Marisah was a blue-shadowed whirlwind, covering his blind spots with a predatory grace that was hypnotic. She used a champagne bottle to smash a knife from a guard's hand and drove her high heel into another's knee, moving not like a fighter, but like a dancer in the dark. Within 30 seconds, the guards were groaning on the floor, and the head of the snake was exposed. Sungkwon reached the booth and grabbed Carlo by the collar, twisting until the man's golden revolver clattered to the floor. He slammed Carlo's face into the table amidst the spilled wine, his voice a lethal whisper in the man's ear. "You broke the truce. You try to hunt us like animals." He looked at Marisah. She nodded once, the Phantom and the King finally in total, silent alignment. The Gwanseong reckoning was complete. The throne was no longer a seat for one, but a platform for two. 3 months later, the obsidian had been renovated, the air no longer smelling of stagnant fear and Cuban tobacco, but of sharp, modern leather and the cold clarity of a new regime. The velvet was gone, replaced by a minimalist luxury that reflected a kingdom governed by intelligence rather than vulgar excess. Sungkwon stood on the balcony of the penthouse, looking down at the Manhattan skyline, a city that had once belonged to his father's ghost, but now moved to the rhythm of a different heartbeat. The door opened with a silent, familiar precision, and Marisah walked in. She wasn't wearing a crisp white dress shirt or an oversized apron. Instead, she wore a tailored charcoal suit that matched Sungkwon's in both cut and authority, cutting a sharp silhouette against the city lights. She moved with the same predatory grace, but the clumsy shuffle was a memory she had discarded along with her anonymity. She handed him a glass of sparkling water, her green eyes reflecting a calm, terrifying intensity. "The Russians agreed to the new terms," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that still carried the biting precision of the Gwanseong dialect. "No weapons, only cybersecurity contracts. They understand that the old ways died with Carlo." "Good," Sungkwon replied, setting the glass down on the mahogany table. He reached out and pulled her close, his hands resting on her waist, not with the ownership of a boss, but with the reverence of a partner. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing neither a weapon nor a waitress, but the only person on earth who truly understood the weight of the mask. A playful glint touched his eyes, the remnants of the arrogance that had once defined him now softened by a steely respect. "You know," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, "I still owe you $15,000 for that suit you ruined." Marisah laughed, a rare, beautiful sound that echoed through the redesigned lounge like a victory. "I think we're even, Sungkwon," she replied, her gaze locking onto his. "I saved your life. You gave me back mine." "No," Sungkwon said softly, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "I didn't save you. I just gave you a bigger arena." He kissed her, a slow, deliberate seal on a pact made in the blue shadows of Astoria and the red blood of the Gwanseong. It wasn't a kiss of submission or dominance. It was the union of two predators who had finally found home. The waitress was gone, and the Phantom was retired, replaced by a queen who ruled with a language of power that New York had never heard before. And God help anyone who dared to challenge the throne they had built together. If you the story, kindly drop your comment on the comment box and share your thought with us. Above all, subscribe, share, and like to get to the story as it will every 12 a.m. and 6:45 p.m. Thanks for watching.